On January 22nd, 2026, the Florida Supreme Court Historical Society commemorated the 250th anniversary of the signing of our country's Declaration of Independence with a compelling fireside chat with the acclaimed American historian, Dr. Alan Guelzo, recognized nationally for his contributions to the field. Moderated by former Justice Charles T. Canady, they explored the events leading up to and the global significance of our nation's founders signing the Declaration of Independence 250 years ago.
We're new colleagues and friends, but I have been a fan of Professor Guelzo for probably 30 some odd years. I became familiar with his work a long time ago and have admired it from that time. So it's a special treat to be here with him and to have the opportunity to work with him at the Hamilton School, where we are committed to teaching classical and civic education. And at the core of that work is teaching the coming generation the importance of the rule of law, because we have nothing without the rule of law. And so I am so delighted to have the opportunity to work there with people like Professor Guelzo in that important mission. But to the subject at hand, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which is coming up this summer. And I want to ask the professor some questions about that. We're going to talk about specifically about the Declaration and some issues related to that, and about the Revolution, which started before the Declaration, and the ideas swirling around that. But before we turn to those things, I want to ask the professor to comment about the background circumstances that created the conditions for the Revolution. Professor?
Let me say first, this is my first visit to Tallahassee. And I hope it's not my last. But it does remind me of a story that Lincoln told about his hometown of Springfield, Illinois. He told the story, it ran like this. The Secretary of State, who had an office in the old state capitol in Springfield, was accosted by a minister who showed up and applied to the Secretary of State for the use of the old state capitol building. Well, what use do you have in mind? Asked the Secretary of State. Well, we plan to hold a revival. Well, the Secretary of State said with a little bit of skepticism, what is the theme of this revival? And the minister replied, the second coming of Jesus Christ. To which the Secretary of State replied, oh, no, that won't do. If he's been to Springfield once, he won't be back again. But contrary to that, I do hope to be back in Tallahassee. It's fun to be here, and especially to be here with my new boss, Justice Canady, and to be able to talk to you a little bit about the Declaration of Independence, and maybe even get a little bit of Lincoln in there. Background to the Declaration. Think of it this way. No one planned to settle North America. There was no great strategic concept. The English decided that they wanted to lay claim to the North American seaboard, but the English government was stingy. They did not plan to do it themselves. Instead, they would franchise it out. So they franchised it out to outfits like the Virginia Company. That did not end well for the Virginia Company. They went bankrupt. Then they franchised it out to the Massachusetts Bay Company, which was really not a company. It was Puritan dissenters from the Church of England who were looking for a refuge. And then on it went. And what became very apparent was that no one was really settling North America at the behest of the British government. British government really did not want to get involved. Instead, the British government would allow various interesting groups of people who the British government really didn't want still to be in Britain, and sent them off to North America, hoping they would never hear from them again. Puritans, Quakers, Catholics, convicts, runaways, people like that, people who were regarded by the Brits as basically the refuse of British society. And so they were all sent to North America and said, here's your one-way ticket. And then after 3 generations, the British government looked at what was happening and realized that they had developed an unfavorable balance of trade with those colonies, because all of those ne'er-do-wells who were shipped across the Atlantic turned out to be extraordinarily successful. So at that point, the British decided, let's do what everyone else does in this kind of circumstance. Let's tax them. So this began in the 1690s with the Wool Act, and then it moved in the 1730s to a Sugar Act. But people in the colonies didn't mind this too much because that was taxes on external trade. British government was taking no notice of what was going on in the government of the colonies. The colonies, because they were 3,000 miles away from Britain, had to improvise their own governments. So they improvised their own state legislatures. And they improvised this, and they improvised that, and above all, they improvised their own taxes at home. Then came the Great 7 Years' War, from the 1750s into the 1760s, which the British Empire won, and evicted the French from North America. And that was when the trouble started, because the British had run up tremendous debts in order to win the 7 Years' War. Well, who was going to help pay for those debts? In the minds of British planners in London, we fought this war in order to evict the French from North America, therefore our British colonists in North America should pay some of the freight. And so the first of a series of taxes was levied. Another Sugar Act in 1764, a Stamp Act in 1765. And the colonies responded to that by saying, wait a minute, these are not taxes on trade. These are taxes on our domestic affairs. These are taxes at home. We've always governed ourselves at home. Remember, you sent us over here because you didn't want us in Great Britain? Okay, well, we took you seriously. We invented our own governments and we tax ourselves, and we don't even send you the bill. And the British imperial government said, yes, but we have big debts. And you might say that provides the big picture to the background of the American Revolution.
All right. With that background in mind, what specific events, Professor, were there that triggered the outbreak of the Revolution?
Well, it was really a series. It was a building series of events, antagonisms, misunderstandings. It really starts with the Stamp Act, because the Stamp Act, if you want to talk about a tax law that interferes with the everyday operations of everything in the colonies, that's what the Stamp Act is. The Stamp Act required the imposition of a stamp on every legal document, and on every newspaper, and on every deck of playing cards. Even the dice, you had to have a stamp. And the stamps would be sold by specially appointed royal stamp agents in the colonies. And the people in the colonies said, we've never done it that way before. And so they complained. They complained and they resisted. And they did unpleasant things to these Stamp Act agents, such as tar and feathers. And then they persuaded, very gently of course, but they persuaded a number of the stamp agents to resign. Finally, after much protest and much indignation, the British Parliament decided that they weren't getting any revenue out of the Stamp Act as it was, so, all right, let's repeal the Stamp Act. America rejoiced. New York ordered a statue of the new king, George III, to be erected in Lower Manhattan. Everyone thought, all right, problem solved. No. Because while the Stamp Act was repealed, Parliament also passed a declaratory act which said, all right, we repealed the Stamp Act. It wasn't a good policy, but we reserve the right to impose direct taxes on the colonies. And it wasn't terribly long before Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, presented Parliament with a new list of internal taxes called the Townshend Duties. And this was adopted by Parliament in 1768 and came into effect, and it also triggered yet another wave of still more sensational noise and resistance. Smuggling was only the most gentle way Americans had of evading paying the taxes. All of this went on and off and on and off from 1768 all the way until 1773. And in the midst of this, there were clashes and confrontations, the most violent of which occurred in Boston in December of 1773, when a squadron of British soldiers opened fire on a mob that was threatening them in the streets of Boston. This was known as the Boston Massacre. It was sensational. 5 civilians were killed by British soldiers there. Then in 1773, Parliament put the cherry on top, so to speak. They passed the Tea Act. Now, the Tea Act, you have to understand, was originally intended to be a measure of generosity, because Britain's East India Company, which supplied tea and then more tea, was in bad financial straits. So there had to be a bailout. Great shades of Chrysler, you know. So there had to be a bailout, and the bailout was going to be that the British government would sponsor the sale of East India tea at absolutely cut-rate fire sale prices. In effect, they would be dumped. And who would have the tea dumped on them at those prices? The American colonies. And so the tea ships showed up in various American harbors, including Boston. Americans said, this is a trick. This is a cheap device whereby the tea is sold at very, very good prices, and the tax is built into it. This is a way of tricking us to pay the tax and recognize the legitimacy of Parliament to tax us. We're not fooled. We're not going along with it. And one night in December of 1773, a protesting crowd boarded 3 tea ships in Boston Harbor. 300 and some chests of tea were thrown overboard in what became known as the Boston Tea Party. This was not received cheerfully by Parliament or the King. I mean, it's one thing to complain about taxes, another thing to actually resist a lot of tax, but to destroy property, that crossed a line. And so the British government responded with the acts that are sometimes known as the coercive acts, sometimes as the intolerable acts. It's a series of bills that basically shut down the Massachusetts government, put it under direct British military rule, and said, this is going to be the way things are going to go until you provide restitution. The Americans were not particularly inclined to provide restitution. Instead, they called a Continental Congress, representatives of all of the colonies, to meet in Philadelphia in September and October of 1774. The First Continental Congress wanted very hard to work something out with Britain, and so petitions were to be presented to the King and to Parliament, asking for some kind of peaceful settlement and resolution of this conflict. That, however, was not the message that was gotten in Massachusetts. The British military governor in Massachusetts, Thomas Gage, was quite aware that the countryside was organizing and arming. And so in April of 1775, he decided he needed to take preemptive action. And so a British military force on the 18th of April was dispatched overland to where it was understood arms were being stored at Concord, Massachusetts. They got as far as Lexington when they were stopped by the Lexington militia. The British regulars opened fire. Several of the Lexington militia were killed, and the British regulars pressed on to Concord. By the time they got to Concord, though, word had spread through the countryside about the British incursion and what had happened at Lexington Green. And there, the militia of many of the towns showed up, confronted the British, forced them into retreat, harried them all the way back on the road to Boston. And suddenly, you had an armed revolt. A Second Continental Congress was convened in May of 1775. They created a Continental Army and selected Virginia Colonel George Washington to command it. Was there going to be a settlement, though? Washington besieged the British in Boston and forced them to abandon it in the spring of 1776. But by then, the Continental Congress had caught the fever. Nothing was going to be resolved. Year after year after year after year of appeal and petition had gone to Britain and ended up with nothing. And so voice after voice now began to call for something more radical, and that was independence. And they were helped to that conclusion by a pamphlet written by an English-born writer named Thomas Paine. And in this pamphlet, Paine not only called upon Americans to move towards independence, but ridiculed the very notion of monarchical government. I mean, talk about taking all the sacred vessels and using them for unholy purposes. That is what Thomas Paine was doing by questioning monarchy. What is a king, he said? A crowned ruffian. An honest man is of more worth than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived. What is a king's job? King's job is to give away places to his favorites. That's all that a king does. With the encouragement of Thomas Paine's pamphlet, which sold something like 300,000 copies. With that, and with the armed conflict that had broken out at Lexington and Concord, which also was continued at Bunker Hill, and then continued through the siege of Boston, the Continental Congress convened and then adopted the resolution offered on the floor by Richard Henry Lee of Virginia, that these united colonies are and of a right ought to be free and independent states. A committee was formed to write a declaration of sentiments. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and a young man from Virginia who was recognized as having quite a talented pen, Thomas Jefferson. And then Jefferson emerged really as the architect of the Declaration, and it was submitted to the Continental Congress for their deliberation. They adopt this Declaration of Independence by vote on July 2nd, 1776, and the formal presentation of the Declaration is to take place on July 4th, 1776. A new nation has been called into being, called the United States, not colonies, the United States of America. 250 years on, that's what we're celebrating.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Well, Professor, you talked about Tom Paine and his ideas that were expressed in his writings. Could you talk some more about the other ideas that have been used to explain the Revolution, including in particular ideas about law and the British Constitution?
Originally, the colonists hoped that they could appeal to British law for redress of grievances. They hoped they could appeal to Parliament. They hoped they could appeal to the king. They saw themselves as standing in a great tradition of English law, both common law and statute law, and they believed that these were things that ought to carry weight and arguments that ought to carry weight in Britain. Their disappointment was to find that Parliament, instead of sitting down to discuss matters and points of law, was mostly interested in power. Who was to be in charge? And after a period of time, the colonists conclude that it is not Parliament that is going to help us. We need to appeal over the head of Parliament to the king. For surely our gracious and kindly king will listen to the plea of his colonists. The king was disinclined to listen. This is not because George III was necessarily some cartoon tyrant. To the contrary, George III was actually a remarkably enlightened monarch. But George III also understood that if the Americans were allowed to call their own shots in their own way, then even if they didn't actually declare independence, they would be functioning almost as though they were independent, and that was going to set a bad example to other British possessions around the world. In fact, it was going to set a worse example to British suppliers, producers, and manufacturers at home who would decide that maybe they ought to relocate to America. And so the king put his foot down. No, if we allow the Americans to get away with this, then that'll be an end to the British Empire as an empire. We cannot have that. And so the king becomes stubborn. And when Americans realize that they will not be heard in terms of law, either by Parliament or by the king, or even for that matter, by the English court system, that is when they have to understand that this is a movement of revolution, not simply of compromise, not simply of discussion. It's going to have to be a movement of revolution. Revolution is about discontinuity. It's about doing something different. And it was at that moment, with that realization, that Americans concluded that what they needed was not just independence from Britain, in the sense of not owing a particular allegiance to Britain. What they needed to do was have an entirely different system of governing. And that new system of governing was going to be called a republic. There would be no king. It's not a question of whether there should be a good king or a mediocre king or a kindly king or a friendly king or a nasty king. They would move to eliminate monarchy entirely. No kingly government at all. Once you start there, then the question becomes, where's the inspiration and the direction going to come for a new system? In the hands of people like Thomas Jefferson, and in the hands of great American writers on law like John Adams, the decision was to look to the 18th century Enlightenment, in which so many Americans had participated, and to look to great political philosophers of the Enlightenment like John Locke and his 2 treatises on government, to the Baron Montesquieu and his Spirit of the Laws, to the Italian jurist Cesare Beccaria on crimes and punishments, and there to discover what law must be in a republic. In a republic, as opposed to a monarchy, law arises as a principle from the sovereignty of the people. It moves up and is manifested through statute and then through the courts and through representation. Monarchy is different. Monarchy understands that law begins with the authority of the king and only then trickles down through the nobility and parliament to the ordinary people. The American Revolution proceeded to invert that. There would be a new system of law, and it would be a new system of law appropriate to a republic, because it would be a system of law that represented and spoke for the sovereignty of the people, not of kings, not of dukes, not of princes, not of nobility, but of the people as a whole. At that moment, critics would say, "Oh, come on. You can't be serious. You are going to trust the people? Aren't kings born to be kings? Aren't nobility born to be nobility? Weren't they born booted and saddled and ready to ride, all the rest of us? Don't we need direction from kings?" To which the American revolutionaries responded, "Not that we've noticed. We've been governing ourselves for a long time. This whole arrangement called a revolution arose out of a question of whether Americans were capable of governing themselves. And Americans looked around and said, well, we have Thomas Jefferson, we have John Adams, we have Benjamin Franklin, we have George Washington, we have Samuel Adams, and we have George Mason, and we have John Dickinson. That's better than I think most of the nobility in England." So you see, the idea that people as a whole had the capacity to govern themselves was a new way of thinking. But as soon as Americans embraced that, then they had reversed the old hierarchy and hierarchical systems. And now sovereignty was going to emerge from the ranks of the people themselves, and the people were going to show that, in fact, they were quite perfectly capable of governing themselves, thank you. And they did not need a duke, a prince, a count, or anyone with some kind of noble title to tell them what to do or to stand there waiting for people to take their hats off to them. And the American experiment was going to be something very, very different. It was going to be law for a republic. And the design of that republic would reach all the way back, historically, to the days of classical Greece and classical Rome, and the great law systems that arose out of the Roman Republic and the Athenian democracy. And they would arise out of the 18th century Enlightenment. And we would have what one of our national mottos expresses, coined at that time, Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order in the ages. We would set a new example that the people could, in fact, govern themselves. And that was going to come to an immediate test in the controversies and conflicts of the Revolution and in those times which would come immediately after it. But that was the question. Can people, ordinary people, govern themselves? The answer of the American Republic was, yes, indeed.
Thank you. Thank you again, Professor. You have spent your life as an historian. The center of your work has been Abraham Lincoln. You've written much about Lincoln, and I know you believe that the Declaration was important to Lincoln. You've written about that, but I'd like for you now to tell us the significance of the Declaration for Abraham Lincoln's statesmanship.
For much of his life, Abraham Lincoln was two things that were unremarkable in the great scheme of affairs. One is he was a lawyer. All right, I know. Yes, that's supposed to be important to this group. But in the great scheme of things, he was a lawyer. He was a trial lawyer, and he was a good trial lawyer, too. He was also a politician. He loved politics. He loved the nuts and bolts of politics. And up until the 1850s, he did not really practice much more beyond that. But in 1854, a particularly noxious piece of legislation was adopted by the United States Congress called the Kansas-Nebraska Bill. And why this bill was so noxious emerges from the fact that up till that point, although slavery had been legal in a number of states of the American Republic, Lincoln believed this was also always a carryover from the old colonial days and was doomed eventually to be extinguished on its own. Don't kick the sleeping dog, he's going to die anyway. And Lincoln was confident, right up until 1854, that slavery was on its own path to extinction. All we had to do was prevent it from expanding any further. Then came the Kansas-Nebraska Bill, which opened the possibility of the legalization of slavery everywhere in the Western territories. At that point, Lincoln said, we awoke as from a sleep. We awoke and we all reached for whatever weapon we could find, a scythe, a butcher's cleaver, anything like that, politically speaking. And we were going to oppose the Kansas-Nebraska Bill and the spread of slavery. We were going to put slavery back in the place where it was going to die on its own. And that was when Lincoln began the first of a great series of invocations of the Declaration of Independence. Because why? Why should, if Congress said that it was fine to legalize slavery in the Western territories, why not? And Lincoln said, why not, except that the Declaration of Independence tells us something else. In the first great speech he gives on this subject, opposing the Kansas-Nebraska Bill on October 16, 1854, in Peoria, Illinois, he says exactly in these terms, he poses exactly that question. And he says to the people who are listening to him in that audience in Peoria, what is the basic premise of the American Republic? What do we read in the Declaration of Independence? That governments are brought into being by the consent of the governed. How can slavery be reconciled with consent? How can you say to a slave, you are not permitted to govern yourself, and then turn around and say to other people, oh yes, we believe in the consent of the governed? He said this is a contradiction. The consent of the governed, as we find it in the Declaration of Independence, is the sheet anchor of American republicanism. Without it, we drift. We have no purpose. We have no course. That, he said, that is the most important aspect of what we do as Americans, and that is what we find in the Declaration of Independence. But what, he went on in a later letter to ask, what are we doing now? Look at us. Now we come to July 4th every year, and we want to read the Declaration of Independence only to find that it is hawked at, spat at, ground into the ground. July 4th has become good, he said, for nothing except burning firecrackers. All real principle has been evacuated. And he said, this is wrong. This is not what the American Revolution was about, and it is not what the Declaration of Independence is about. And that is what propels him back into political life and eventually to his election to the presidency in 1860. And when he comes on his inaugural tour from Illinois, his home in Illinois, to Washington, D.C., he stops, first of all, in Trenton, where he speaks to the state senate. And he says, do you know what moved me the most as a boy? It was reading about the Battle of Trenton. It was reading about the Revolution. And the sense, he says, the sense I had then was that what was at stake in the Battle of Trenton and in the Revolution was more than just loosing our ties to the mother country. It was about a principle. And that principle is what we have to owe our allegiance to. The next day he comes to Philadelphia. He's there standing in Independence Hall, and he says, I have never had a thought politically that did not arise from the Declaration of Independence. We will not give up that principle, he said. Rather than give that up, he went on to add, I would rather be assassinated on the spot. 4 years and 2 months later, his body would lie in state in that same Independence Hall. But he goes on to Washington. He's sworn in. And he is constantly reminding people, what is the principle we are guided by? We are guided by what we find in that declaration. That all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He was asked at one point a question, what is democracy? He replied, not so much by defining democracy as by giving what you might call a negative definition of democracy. He says, as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. Consent, the consent of the governed. That was the central burning principle in his mind, which slavery contradicted, and which he spent his presidency opposing, first in the form of the Great Emancipation Proclamation, and then finally the signature he puts to the 13th Amendment in January of 1865, abolishing slavery forever in the United States. And what is guiding him at each of those steps from 1854 to 1865? The Declaration of Independence. Now you might say, look, the Declaration of Independence, that was 8 decades before. Isn't that a little out of date? I mean, don't we have to keep up with the times? And Lincoln's response was, no, because those truths transcend times. When he went to Gettysburg in November of 1863 to dedicate the Soldiers' National Cemetery there after the Great Battle, he uttered words that we all recognize, but precisely because we recognize them so routinely, we don't often reflect on their importance. How does he begin? 77 years ago. In other words, 1776. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. There's the Declaration right out in front. What are we fighting for in this war? For territory? No. For economic advantage? No. We're not even fighting for Greenland. We are fighting for an idea that is captured in a proposition. Now think of this. Think of how many people in the 19th century would have heard that and thought that was about the funniest thing they'd ever heard in their lives. Oh, you're going to found a country on a proposition? A logical statement? No, countries should be founded on race. They should be founded on religion. They should be founded on ethnicity. They should be founded on kings, on soil and blood. We should be appealing to the Volk. And instead, Lincoln says, the American Republic is dedicated to none of those things. We are dedicated to a proposition. And that means that anybody who embraces that proposition is in. My great-grandfather from Sweden left everything behind, came to America. Even though all of his relatives were pleading with him to stay, he came to America. He copied out in pencil the Gettysburg Address, the Declaration of Independence. He couldn't wait to abjure the King of Sweden. He wanted to live in a land dedicated to a proposition. Old Baron von Steuben in the snows of Valley Forge, training Washington's Continentals, wrote back to a friend of his in Germany. He said, the great difference between Germans and Americans is this. When you give an order to the Germans, they immediately obey it. When you give an order to the Americans, you also have to explain to them why they should obey. Because we are dedicated to a proposition that all men are created equal. And what is happening there in that Gettysburg Address? Notice how he starts you at the past, 1776. Then he takes you to the present. We're here on a battlefield of that great war. And then he takes you to the future. We must be dedicated. The ground's already been dedicated by the soldiers who fought here. We must be dedicated. And if we will be thus dedicated, then what will happen? What will happen will be a new birth of freedom and government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. If we will be motivated, if we will be guided, if we will be inspired by that same declaration that inspired the soldiers of the Civil War and the soldiers of the Revolution, yes, then this idea of government that the people rule, that will go on and on. And that, in Lincoln's mind, is what that great and terrible Civil War was all about. Yes, for Lincoln, the centrality of the Declaration. For him, you don't budge beyond that.
Thank you.
Professor, I would like to go on for an hour, but I think the hour of adjournment has arrived.
May I tell one quick story?
Please do.
In 1864, in the height of the Civil War, two photographers in Connecticut hatched the wonderful idea of tracking down the last surviving veterans of the Revolution. For in fact, there were at least 6 of them. And so they journeyed to their homes and took their photographs and published the photographs in a book called The Last Men of the Revolution. And some of those men of the Revolution had not played what you might call gigantic parts. One had only been in the militia for 6 months. But one of them had been at Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga. And at the end of the Revolution, he had lighted 13 candles in honor of the independence of the 13 states. Those 13 candles stand for hope. And that is a hope that should guide us today as we remember the 250th anniversary of American independence.
Mm-hmm.